On today's episode, we learn about ableist language. Take a look at a person who still believes that vaccines and masks prevent COVID. Learn why people voluntarily trading goods and services is a bad thing. And finally, examine a Paul Krugman chart. This is Cringe Posts. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of the Cringe Post podcast. This is the podcast where we assemble and gather the cringiest political and cultural takes that we see in our feeds each week. And we kind of go through where they went wrong, how they could go right, and try to have a little bit of fun and a laugh along the way. My name's Britt. I'm here with my co-host Donnie. And if you are enjoying our show or you want to, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Leave us a DM, a comment, any of that stuff. It really helps us out, and we love hearing from you. And if you are one of those folks that listens to podcasts instead of watching it, we show all of the different Cringe Posts on our YouTube channel, as well as if you go to cringepost.com, we have a link to a visual show companion so you can see all the stuff that we're going through as we go through it. You know, before we poke fun at other people, we like to, kind of poke fun at ourselves, show where we've gone wrong, and hopefully that we've kind of gone right since where we've gone wrong. And today, I've got a tweet by Donnie here, and he writes, "iPads aren't useful! ! Get a Windows Phone 7." This was a very, Donnie and I were friends in college, good friends in college, and he and his brother David were very much evangelists for the Microsoft phone environment, very anti-Apple. But to go as far as to say that an iPad is not useful, I mean, a computer the size of a piece of paper?
I know.
Sounds kinda useful.
What I hate about this is like I still think I still will be an apologist for Windows Phone. I love the design language. I love a lot of what they did right, but it is so ironic to me that my criticism of the iPad in this particular case is it's not useful, and then I juxtapose that with Windows Phone, which where the major fatal flaw is that Microsoft didn't develop the relationships with third-party developers, so it didn't have applications it took like 2 years before Facebook had an official app for Windows Phone and stuff. So it was the very thing that I'm criticizing the iPad for, where it's not useful. It's like that was the big limiting factor of a Windows Phone. It's like a Windows Phone was great. The problem was it wasn't as useful because of all of the support it couldn't get. And so I'm like, but an iPad, that's what I need to tackle. And also just how unimaginative I am thinking that like an iPad couldn't be useful. It's like just because it doesn't suit my specific needs means it's not useful.
And that's kind of the what was so brilliant about Apple was they said, no, we've got our user base down and we will make it so they can only do these certain things. And they were very specialized in what they did, but they specialized for a really broad audience and made sure that everything just worked. Like that was kind of the Apple thing, was like, it just needs to work. And people, and that it's just seamless user experience, all that stuff. And then Windows was for the more, kind of nerd engineer types that really did want to tweak everything. So, I mean, your hostility towards it is understandable, right? Like, you
Right.
fit into that category, and I don't mean that in a denigrating way. I mean,
How
that
dare
in an
you?
awesome
How
way.
dare you, sir?
Yeah. I work in engineering a little bit more now, and so most people still don't like the Apple environment, but it's like, well, a simple solution is usually really well engineered, right? And Apple stuff is really well done for the most part.
Yeah, it's kind of along the lines of the best written things are generally short, right? They're not overly long, they're not overly concise. It's a lot harder to get something done correctly that's simple rather than the reverse there. So I think that's kind of Apple's design philosophy in many ways. And you know what? Again, I think to me the cringiest part is just me not having the ability to think that there are purposes and uses that something that doesn't affect me personally can have that make it a useful thing. It's just I'm the only one whose needs are relevant, and therefore the world caters to my specific needs. Therefore, an iPad doesn't fit my needs. It's not useful, period.
Yeah. If it doesn't make sense to you, it shouldn't make sense to anyone.
Yeah,
It's kind of
exactly
the message. Yeah. All right, moving on from that age-old debate, we're going to take on some other folks' cringes. So today, our first one is from a Twitter user, and she tweets out, "Some ableist words you should probably cut out of your vocabulary because they're ableist. Idiotic and idiot. Crazy. differently abled, dumb, insane, lame, moron, psycho, specially abled, stupid. There are many more, and if anyone wants to add some, feel free below. I think you and I think I shared this with you, but I went my last class. I had 1 credit remaining at university, and I had to take a class, and it was fine. But I got back on the email list for our university with all of these different, groups and stuff. And our university is traditionally pretty conservative, Christian conservative place. So I was really surprised to see a microaggressions seminar that a part of the student body was putting on. And so I went and joined it, and they had a microaggressions section where they basically had to split it into groups, and they said, "Hey, everyone, like talk about why saying a certain thing would be considered microaggression or offensive." And they had one scenario where they said, "Hey, you're talking to someone in a wheelchair, and they've just accomplished something really awesome, and you say to them, 'Wow, like that's so amazing. Despite the fact that you're in a wheelchair." Despite the fact that you're disabled, it's amazing that you accomplished this. Whether it's, you went to the Olympic Games for the disabled, or you did something else that, that would be normally pretty hard unless you had the use of your legs. And so they were trying to say that's a bad thing to say that to someone. And this one gal that was in my group, she's like, "Well, the reason this is a microaggression, the reason this is so offensive and awful is because, by saying something like that, you're claiming that you have something that they don't have." And I was like, man, like, yeah, I've got the use of my legs and they don't have the use of their legs. Like, it's just a recognition of reality. And I think that's what's kind of so baked into this ableist thing. It's like, I get it. Like, you shouldn't shame or put down or make fun of people, that are disabled. But at the same time, it's like, it's kind of shameful and patronizing to like say, well, I'm not going to recognize the reality that affects your life, right? Like, you live with a reality that you are not able to use your legs, or that you have some sort of deficiency, whether you caused it or you were born with it or it came about not because of your fault. Like, it's a reality for you. And how patronizing of me to think that I can't recognize that in your life, right? Or that I shouldn't like accommodate you in that way, or be thinking about that as part of who you are, because that's just a reality, right? And that's these people want to shape and mold reality to whatever suits their needs. And so the natural conclusion of that is that you can't recognize differences. And I mean, this extends all the way to gender and biology, all the way to economics. This, subjectivist, relativist, cultural Marxist philosophy permeates and destroys everything it touches, even people that are in wheelchairs, because we can't recognize that they don't have the use of their legs.
What's so frustrating too is this jumps to the past the term disabled. Disabled isn't on there because that's presumed to be offensive, and differently abled and specially abled were already terms that were created in order to accommodate people who felt offended by the term disabled. And even with the term disabled, it's merely it's the same thing we've talked about before, where whatever that inability is, it is a deviation from the norm. And that's not to say that that person is worth less, but it is just to acknowledge, like you said, reality. So to say someone cannot use their legs are disabled, so therefore they are a disabled person. And that shorthand is it's not like a condemnation of that person. It's not saying, oh, well, they're disabled. It's to say that, it's, again, the language is only helpful when we're all speaking on sort of universal terms, and meanings that you convey in shorthand can convey the message you mean. So to say we need to make accommodations for this disabled person, when you're able to use that, what people can understand is, oh, we need to have an accessible accommodation because this person deviates from the norm. And that's fine, because deviations from the norm are normal for that to happen. But there's also so many other things here, like idiot and idiotic and moron. What's insane about those, also a word on the list, is moron specifically was coined. The word was coined to denote a specific level of intelligence that someone had that was limited. So I believe it was I believe it was originally measured by IQ points, and I don't know the exact numbers, but roughly speaking, moron was coined in order to sort of to denote a person who was a grown adult, but their brain capability had not developed beyond that of like a 12-year-old or so. That was roughly it. And idiot was the same. I want to say idiot was maybe 2 years old, and then I think imbecile, which isn't on here, but was another one of these where they had very specific meanings as to measuring the level of intelligence. They were used clinically. And then, because people started using them derogatorily, people came up with a term that was supposed to be politically correct. And that term was retarded. That term was supposed to be the nice way to say moron or idiot or imbecile, because those had specific meanings. And so if you were calling someone, oh, you're being a moron, you were very clearly specifically saying your brain had not developed past that of a 12-year-old, and that was seen as harmful. And so then they came, and now, of course, retarded is one of the words that people do not want you to say in any kind of context, even though that was originally made to be the nice word for all this. And so this whole post, these words, I'm gonna try to use as many of these because they're not offensive. They really aren't. It's crazy how many of these words are very stupidly put here. It's just dumb that we would cater to this kind of thing, because language, if you keep adapting it and you keep having to shift it in ways that people get offended by terms that are invented in order to cater for others, like that's why you can't let language be decided by people who want to police what you say and who want to tell you can't say that thing, because then your language just continually shifts in circles that are pointless and people aren't able to effectively and clearly communicate.
It's funny, man. I don't know the date for this. There's no timestamp on it, but
This was
sure
recent, like within the last few days.
Okay, yeah. So this is probably all stems from, Beyonce had a song come out, and it had the word spaz in it, and she received a bunch of backlash because she used the word spaz. And it's very similar to Lizzo, who is an obese American pop star. I think it was like a year or 2 years ago, she came out with a song that also had spaz in it, and she made this post, man, where she's like, hey, I'm so sorry. I use the word spaz as a fat person of color in America. Like, I understand like how words have meaning and can hurt. It's like, whoa, like I'm pretty sure fat, if you or I or Jordan Peterson or someone, in the cultural sphere use that word about someone, and that person wasn't fat or accepted, on the intersectional levels, they would be like, well, that would make this list as well, right? But because Lizzo has that privilege, right, she's able to use that word and call herself that, and it's not a shameful thing, because for her, it's basically they're trying to adopt language however they want to use it. It's okay, and if you're using it in a way that they don't want you to use it in, then it's not okay, and you're a racist, jerk, bigot, and you're lame and a psycho, and all the words that are on this list, right? Like, they'll call you that, and it's fine because they're the ones calling you that. And so when you see things like this, or you see people in, your feeds doing things like this, where they try and flip the tables on you and say that, don't use that because you're being, insensitive or you're being a jerk. It's like, realize that they don't actually care about the principle of it, because they would just as much use these words if it suited them, as much as limit you to using them because it suits your point. And to be clear, I don't really condone calling anyone an idiot or crazy or morons or anything like that. In terms of like a personal affront, like if they are genuinely being a moron, acting in a way that had, like you were saying, an IQ that is below a certain amount, then sure, you could call them that all you want. And there's quite a bit of people like that, that probably deserve it. But regardless, it's like it's just all control to limit speech. It's not, and by limiting speech, they're trying to limit how you think. It's not because they're trying to be kind or courteous or anything like that.
And I think that that's an important distinction, because the real thing is, when I want people to speak kindly to each other, and in the discourse I have with people, I don't want to use profanity, for instance. I don't think that it's offensive in a way that means that I should tell everyone else, you can never swear ever. Don't use profanity. I want to, by example, encourage people to not use profanity, because people find it offensive. People find it vulgar. People find it crude. And I do want to elevate speech and speaking. The problem is when you get to the point where you're trying to force these terms rather than react to the ways that the culture already sees them, that's where I sort of have this issue, right? For instance, I don't like the idea that you're coming up with these terms that all are very colloquially understood and I don't think any of these are particularly outrageous. I think they're all very tame when you look at them for the most part. And so the idea that you're taking these relatively culturally tame words and you're stirring them up to sort of trigger people and excite them and get them offended by it, that's the problem I have, where you're trying to actively rally, we need to stop this, and people, you should be offended, because frankly, most of these words, while, some of them are rooted in like disabilities, right? Like dumb, meaning you can't speak. I don't, and maybe this is my ignorance, but I just don't know that many people who are dumb, who can't speak, who are wildly offended about this. And I still think that the culture is probably a better place when, you can choose to not engage in that sort of dialogue yourself. And you can, if you're offended, that's okay. You can get over it. That's the kind of culture I'd rather promote, rather than saying, hey, this term was rooted in historic ways that made fun of you. You should be mad and upset about that. I don't want that to be the culture. I want the culture to be like, oh yeah, that term used to have bad origins, but now it's really evolved and it doesn't really mean that anymore. And if that's, if you don't like that, yeah, that sucks, and we'll try not to use that around you. But growing a thicker skin over it, I'd much rather have that, and promoting more speech and not trying to police people and lead by example rather than sort of shutting down people, saying you can't use these words because they're ableist. That's okay. The last thing I will say, that's the other thing about it, is the language. When you're trying to tell people why it's offensive, it doesn't help to just tell them that by using it you're a bigot. That's never effective. For instance, if I want to tell people, like, if I want them to stop saying "oh my God" because I find that offensive, I wouldn't say because it's unholy, because you're a heretic. I'd say, oh, well, I don't think you should, because as a Christian, one of the commandments is to not take the Lord's name in vain. So for me, that's my reasoning. And so doing that, you're taking something sacred and you're putting it to the banal. So that's why it's offensive to me. Now, I'm not saying because you're a terrible person. That's why. If you're doing that, you're awful. You're a racist. You're a sexist. You're going to hell. That's never convincing, and that's usually the root argument that these people have, as exemplified in this tweet. Here's ableist words you shouldn't use because they're ableist. That's tautological.
Yes. It's classic. All right. Moving on to our next one. We've got a series of tweets. The first one by The Verge. They're putting out an article that the headline is TwitchCon San Diego will not require masks or vaccinations. And then a user that's pretty based replies, well done to TwitchCon. Time to move on. COVID will be with us forever, just like hundreds of other viruses. It's time to get on with normality and protect the vulnerable. And then this cringy user replies, want to share how you're going to protect the, quote, vulnerable, unquote, with no one getting vaccinated or wearing masks? And it's like, okay, when I looked at this, I had to make sure there was a good timestamp. It's August 2nd, 2022. So today, the day that we're recording this. Oh my gosh. And it's like, okay, if this was March of 2020, like maybe this would be somewhat acceptable, right? Like no one really knew what was going on, much less there was no vaccine. But let's say there was a vaccine. No one even knew if it was, the going assumption was that it worked, and that like any vaccine does, it makes you immune to the virus and from being able to spread it. We now have almost 2.5 years of data that show that wearing masks doesn't actually help protect you from COVID. The vaccine, despite how many times you get it shot into your system, doesn't actually stop you from getting sick, much less actually transmitting it. And none of the measures that, all of the measures actually that the public health apparatus recommended have now been proven to be, not have worked. And even a lot of them they're trying to disclaim them. Like last week, Dr. Anthony Fauci is now trying to claim that he never recommended that we lock down. When there's, you go on the news or on YouTube and he was on there every single day basically saying we need to shut down the whole country. You can't spend Christmas or the holidays with your family, and maybe kids shouldn't go back to school, and maybe we won't be able to reopen for another year and a half, and all these sorts of things. And so it's like, after all of that, right, we've seen this the past few months. All the vaunted experts are now walking back their claims. We have empirical data that shows that none of this stuff works. And this person somehow has access to the internet and also still believes that these things work. That's crazy, man. It's like, this must be an NPC. I don't see any other way. Like, I don't think you can be a thinking person and have a connection to the internet and been alive and conscious the past 2 years and say, like, oh, how are you going to protect the vulnerable? It's like, you're not going to protect the vulnerable. Like, the way to protect the vulnerable is for the vulnerable to stay home and to quarantine. That's the focused protection that the Great Barrington Declaration advocated for is the only way to actually reduce deaths. And we've seen that basically, it's been proven in a lot of the Nordic countries. And then we've seen it on a micro scale here, in different towns when you adjust for age and all these different things. But kind of a weird time travel. This person must have woken up from a coma. They went in right in, April of 2020 and woke up just now.
Well, and what's crazy is this person's not even listening to the Lord and Savior of science, Anthony Fauci, because his more recent interviews, he said things like, we never, I mean, he's lying through his teeth, obviously, but we never said that you can spread or the vaccine wouldn't have you spread COVID or whatever. They're walking back even that claim. So according to the narrative, it's okay to admit that vaccines and masks, you can still transmit the disease. Again, they will, on the one hand, tell you that, and then on the other hand, still tell you to get vaccinated and get the and wear masks. Otherwise, you're selfish. But so it's even a part of the sort of the official narrative. But this is also, I mean, in a sense, kind of related to the disabled conversation we were just having, because it's almost as though these people would rather, and I think in many cases they would rather everyone have a lower standard of living if it was equal, rather than letting there be different levels of, living standards, and then everyone's raised up by it. Even if the baseline for the lowest person is higher than the equal baseline, they would rather have everyone be equal. And that means locking people down. That means not enjoying things. If there's some subset of the population that's vulnerable, everyone has to live that way. And, I speaking personally, my grandma has a rare condition that means that she's extremely susceptible to even like the common cold, to the point where like the left side of her body will shut down if she gets a cold. So it's super dangerous for her. So my whole, that was probably when I was, I don't know, around like 10 or so. So, for most of my life, it's been one of those things where we've tried to accommodate. And the thing is, up through COVID, she still lived her normal life. She was cautious. She would take precaution and things like that. But it's like if one of us had a cold, then we wouldn't go up for Christmas because she could get exposed. That kind of thing. And it was unfortunate, but her life was still relatively normal, even though she was vulnerable. Again, to the common cold, which is very, very, common. That's the common cold, I guess.
Transmissible.
Yeah, transmissible, and it's it's evergreen. It's always here. And so it's so frustrating to see these sort of conversations go up around COVID, because frankly it's like this is sort of the micro experience I've had blown up, except everyone's completely overreacting to it. So when this person's saying, want to share how you're going to protect the vulnerable with no one getting vaccinated or wearing masks, well, if you're actually vulnerable, then you probably shouldn't go to TwitchCon regardless of vaccination or mask status, because it can still get transmitted. Or you can live your life regularly, normally, be careful, don't shake hands, wash your hands often, take antibiotics if you can, be good on your vitamins, whatever it is, do what you want to do to experience that. But know that you are vulnerable. The onus is on you to make the wise decisions, because not everyone can live life in a way that accounts for every individual need of every other person. And with COVID, that's just more and more being the case, when even the official narrative admits that masks and vaccinations can still spread the disease.
And that's what's so frustrating about them trying to not, to disclaim all of these things that they did. Because what the scenario you're putting out there, it's like just let businesses and people and entities decide how they're going to address this and measure their risk based on, what personal amount of risk is pertinent to them. And I like you say you have a grocery store, and for whatever reason, these grocery stores have a disproportionate market share of people that are vulnerable to COVID. It's like, okay, well then that grocery store should be able to say, like, yeah, we're going to have specific hours for shoppers that are vulnerable to COVID, and the rules during these hours are for people have to wear masks, and maybe you have to be vaccinated. Like I'm even okay with a store saying that. Um, but on the other side of it, stores that don't care about that, where the vast majority of people are not at risk, should be able to say, hey, you don't need to wear a mask. You can come in here, business as usual, and just let the market sort it out. But because of the government and the state of different governors saying like, well, no, we're going to have a statewide mask mandate, regardless, a lot of it, like here in Washington, driven by King County numbers, the county that has Seattle in it. My one of my, I had a family member who had skin cancer on his face, and he lived in a town in a county that had two cases, and he was not allowed to go in to get the skin cancer removed because it was not what I can't remember what it's called, but basically a necessary surgery because it didn't threaten his life yet. So he had to live with the skin cancer on his face for months, even though there was only 2 cases of COVID in this huge county in the eastern side of the state. And so it's like it's literally applying that one size fits all for everyone, and it never ever works. And if you just let people if we just let people choose what they wanted to do, we would have reached better outcomes, both health wise and economically wise, because everyone would have measured exactly the right amount of solution for the right amount of problem. Um, but yeah, like you're saying, if you're vulnerable or if you're scared of getting sick with COVID, one, you probably should not be on a plane, in a tube with recycled air with a bunch of other people. And then two, you shouldn't be at TwitchCon. Like, just don't go. Like, and the people that aren't scared of that stuff are going to go. And if they're not scared of that stuff, then they shouldn't be worried about wearing a mask, But like you're saying, it's a race to the bottom, lowest common denominator. Everyone kind of like your iPad, if it doesn't suit me, it shouldn't suit anyone else. It's that kind of philosophy.
Yeah. And so, real quick bullet points. One, the other funny thing about this is it's TwitchCon. Highly doubt that there are going to be that many older people there in general. So usually the number of people there who are going to be vulnerable is going to be disproportionately small, and the number of compared to the normal numbers of vulnerable people who are already disproportionately small compared to the normal population. TwitchCon's going to be a relatively healthy and relatively young population attending. So that's kind of silly. Two, as an example of sort of this kind of self-enforced, taking care of your local community, small groups and small organizations are the best ones to make these kinds of rules, not the state. As an example, the church I've been attending for the last like 8 years or so, when I started going, there was maybe like 20 of us total, and now we're up to a group of 100 or so. But one of the very early parishioners who attended had a very severe, I think it was celiac disease, but a very very severe allergies to a lot of different things. And so from a very early on, our church made the communion bread to be free of most major allergens, because at that point it served our congregation's needs to address that member of the community, because it was a very real need, and it was a sacrifice all of us were fine to make because we chose to do that, right? And we still have that tradition as part of it. Now, personally, I would love normal bread because normal bread tastes better than this. It really does. But it's also not the point, and it's also like a sacrifice I'm willing to make. And if not, I could attend another church if that was a big enough deal for me, right? But that's the kind of thing where it's like I voluntary measures like that, I'm totally fine when there is a legitimate, recognizable vulnerability, and there's a very real need to address it. And I think most people in small communities are happy to do that. The problem is when it's top down, one size fits all, and you have to, everyone has to kowtow and cater, and there's no room for choice, no room for living normal. You have to, and you have no say in it.
Well, and that's the problem is there's no one smart enough. None of the health experts, not even Dr. Truth Science himself, knows all of the externalities and edge cases that occur even at just the medical level. I had a family member go through a really, really major surgery, and I was talking with the nurses at this world-renowned medical center, and they were telling me, they're like, yeah, like, even now you're only allowed to have one person, maybe two, if you're lucky, in the room with a person that's recovering from these major surgeries, or that's in the intensive care unit. They would only allow one or two people in there per day, and if you left the room, you were out for the rest of the day. You couldn't come back in. And these nurses are saying, look, we've actually seen an increase in mortality rate because patients recover better when they have loved ones around them post surgery. And this person that had this major surgery said, oh yeah, I could hear you guys talking. You were in the room, and that was really encouraging. And when I woke up and I had the tube down my throat and all this stuff, it was really nice to know that you guys were there. And that is clearly associated, based on these nurses, with having people and family and everyone around is associated with better outcomes for medical patients. But for 2.5 years, we've basically not allowed anyone in to see him. One of my family members had a kid, and the husband wasn't allowed to be there when the kid was born, man. These crazy things. It's Dr. Anthony Fauci is never going to be able to understand the edge cases or the externalities. He's even admitted to so as much. And so just like you're saying, just let the small organizations and individuals choose. And the best outcomes will, as long as they have a place they can go, and it might be an inconvenience to them, it's still going to be a lot better than, forcing everyone into one mold. All right, moving on to our next one. We got a series of tweets. We've got a user who tweets out, quote, "We should be able to murder unborn children whenever we want," unquote. I'm assuming kind of a sarcastic
Yeah, it was in response to an article about the state suing Idaho over abortion access stuff.
Yep. So basically saying, yeah, all those people that are pro Roe v. Wade and all this stuff, you just want to kill children whenever you want. And then this other user replies, "You're right. Republicans prefer to kill them after they leave the womb," and then links to a picture of, Pray for Uvalde with all the different children and school teachers that were killed during that tragedy. And then the little bit better based user replies, "Didn't know that Ramos, the shooter for Uvalde, was a Republican." And then this cringe user replies, "No, but he was enabled by Republican laws." I don't even know where to begin with this, it's he was enabled by Republican laws. So, the Republican laws, I don't really know Republican stances on gun-free zones in schools, but I guess it's generally accepted that Republicans are not really for gun-free zones. Or I guess more pro 2A people, let's just say that, are not for gun-free zones. And generally people of this other person's persuasion they believe that if we make it a crime, no one's going to commit it. Or if we make it a gun-free zone, no one's going to go in there. The reason the Uvalde shooter chose to go to a school was because he knew that there would be no guns there. So if you want to talk about enabling this tragedy, I would start with the fact that most, mass shootings with 4 or more people involved or hurt occur in zones that are gun-free zones. So if you want to tie a law or a policy to these tragedies, it's going to be the any zone that is gun-free. And then on top of that, it's okay, what law has a Republican or a pro 2A person said, oh yeah, you have to own a gun and you have to, go kill people with it? That's what they're inferring. It's in his first post, you're right, Republicans just prefer to kill them after they leave the womb. And as if that almost justifies killing them when they're not in the, when they're still in the womb. It's yeah, it's just all sorts of confused, and you just tell this person is so caught up in ideology that they are blinded to the nastiness of their beliefs and the outcomes of their beliefs. And they're not arguing on principle. They're just arguing from a position of hatred.
Yeah, I think the really disturbing thing to me is that this happy to equate, a bad outcome with a desired outcome. So, the idea that it's Republicans prefer to kill them after they leave the womb. And then the guy points out, well, but the killer wasn't a Republican. And this guy's saying, well, no, but the Republicans let that happen, and they wanted, the implication being like they wanted that to happen. And it's like, oh my gosh, like if you want to talk about actually wanting to kill people without even touching abortion, let's just look at, like, I don't know, New York and locking down patients in COVID hospitals and stuff. Like, it's not exactly a good idea to point partisan fingers when it's talking about wanting to kill people. Foreign policy consensus alone means everyone is culpable. Yeah. But also this assumption that he makes where he says, no, but he was enabled by Republican laws. I find that is such a philosophically like sad and probably normal position to hold, where it's not that violence and tragedy and decay, these kinds of things are normal. It's that a law enabled them to be. And that's just so backwards from the truth. Like, the truth is the world is rough. People are violent. People do destructive things. Destruction is part of nature in many ways. And so, you have to put in work to circumvent those kinds of things, which is great. But the idea that, like, laws are the structure of reality or the structure of foundations, like, this was, he was enabled to kill these things because of laws. I just find that as such a bad, like, government first thinking way to view the world. And then the other thing is, if we are going to look at enabled by Republican laws, the closest thing to that is, the law and order laws that Republicans love of the police who refuse to act. And yes, I bring up how awful and how evil the cops were at Uvalde, and I will continue to do so because they were evil and wrong.
Yes.
And they are culpable for so much of the murder and of the injury that happened there because of their not only their refusal to act, but their active suppressing of people who were willing to be brave and act. So those kinds of laws were the ones. So the ones that he wants to blame, this on Second Amendment, again, not even laws so much as upholding of your constitutional rights or even Supreme Court decisions, but those things are not the reason. It's the law and order, have to submit to the police, has to be a gun-free zone. It's everything, all the laws involved except for the upholding of the Second Amendment that actually contributed to this tragedy. And this person is just got big government on their mind, and it's viewing everything from such a partisan lens they can't even see what happened clearly.
Yeah. Do you have any more on that one?
No, we're good.
Cool. All right. Now we're moving on to a post by Now This Food Verified, and another Twitter user or Facebook user. And Now This Food posted kind of an article, and the headline reads, a Chick-fil-A store in North Carolina is under fire after offering to pay, quote, volunteers, unquote, with chicken instead of money. Earlier this week, the store shared a Facebook post saying it was recruiting volunteers for its drive-thru. And then this Facebook user replies, replacing what is typically a paid employee position with, quote, volunteers rewarded with food seems like a means of skirting labor laws. So I saw this, and it was really, Donnie found it and put it here, but I saw it when I was reviewing these posts, and I was like, I got to look into this because this sounds awesome. Because, as someone that likes Chick-fil-A and all that, like getting free chicken for working. So I went and looked up, and basically this store, because they're all individually owned and managed franchise stores. But this individual store was trying to figure out a way to, like this guy said, skirt labor laws, but in a way that was mutually beneficial, and basically said, hey, if you come work at the drive-thru because we're understaffed, for every hour that you work, we will give you 5 entrees, right? So an entree meal at Chick-fil-A, I think, is like $8 or $9, right? So it's the equivalent of almost $40, maybe a little bit more in services, specifically at Chick-fil-A per hour that these people are getting paid. And when people started criticizing it, the Chick-fil-A said, hey, yeah, you could be mad at us, but everyone that's working this, we've already got a bunch of people that wanted to do this, and they're doing it voluntarily. Like, what's wrong with that? And that's at the core of what's going on here, is that, and the core of minimum wage laws, like how evil they are. It's people that voluntarily, of their own free will and volition, want to go work and are willing to work at whatever agreed upon price, whether it's for $1 or for a piece of chicken, are not allowed to do so. They have to get the blessing and the sanction of the state in order to do so. They can't enter into an agreement voluntarily. And that's it's pretty funny that there's such a like, ooh, they're lying about it being volunteers, or whatever. It's like, no, they're voluntarily choosing to go work in exchange for food. And that's okay as long as no one's holding a gun to their head and saying you have to go do it. Much like the government holds a gun to Chick-fil-A's head and says, hey, you got to pay your taxes and you have to pay your people this much money. And what people don't realize is the reason companies like the reason benefits came about, like company hosted benefits came about, was because companies had to figure out a way to provide more value for their employees without the employees getting taxed, because the income tax is basically a penalization for being productive. So the more productive you are, the more you are penalized, the greater your punishment is at the end of the year, the more tax you have to pay. And so these employers are like, well, we could pay these people a lot of money, but the more we pay them, the more money the government takes. So how about let's, instead of paying them more, let's, shift that value into benefits, which won't be taxed, and stuff that, hypothetically our employees are already paying for. And that we'll offer that as an incentive and good benefits packages and all that stuff. That is very similar to what is going on right here, which is basically like, hey, like, we can't afford to pay you, a lot, but we can give you we've got something here, so let's give you the equivalent value in chicken. And if you like chicken and you're willing to work for an hour at the drive-thru, like, go for it. Let's do it. It's evil to say that you can't do that. It's evil to take people's freedom to choose and enter into those contracts away.
This is, yeah, it's just a crazy example of people freaking out and acting like they own people's bodies. Because, like, if I'm just thinking about it, like, there were plenty of summers where I was working during the summer, but, like, I don't know, the way that I am, I hate the idea. I love fast food, but I hate the idea of spending money on food if I have food at home. And so the idea that, like, I could go out and work an hour or two on a Saturday when I'm not working my other job, and just, like, rack up a bunch of meals to redeem, like a bunch of entrees for, like, that's an amazing deal, because you don't have the commitment of taking on a full, even part-time job that would require anywhere from, like, 10 to 20 hours a week. You're not taking all that. It's on your own. You're not scheduled and shifted. This is an amazing deal for the worker. And like you said, there's, all of the sort of preventions that are built into hiring someone because of the taxes, because of all of the labor laws that this person points out that they're trying to skirt. All of these things have made it so that there are these shortages, and Chick-fil-A can't work out a system that's more flexible. So, it's like if they didn't have to lock in and they wanted to make a temporary contract with an employee, like, hey, look, frankly, we were understaffed on Saturdays at lunchtime. We get a big rush there, and it's during the summer. And hey, you guys are back from college. If you just want to work this Saturday gig, that's it. One shift a week for 4 hours or something like that, and we'll pay you X amount of dollars. There are people who'd love to do that, but you're not able to do that because of these laws. And so they were trying to find a creative solution to work around that. And good for them, because at what point does, I want to say this person's name. At what point does this person get to step in and say, no, you can't make your own agreement with that other person? That would be a labor law violation. What happens when my dad hires me in the office to clean his office, right? I'm like 10 years old and I'm not legally allowed to work, but I want to make money because I want to buy games for the GameCube, and my dad wants his office cleaned. Does this person get to run and say, no, labor law violation? Or is there get to be a voluntary exchange made? Now that one's even different because it involves, me as a 10-year-old, but this isn't even saying that. It's just a volunteer. It could be anyone. And they're precluding anyone from being able to make this kind of involvement because they're such busybodies. They have to stick their nose into your business.
Yeah. All I'm saying is, do not let, I want to say the person's name too, but don't let this person know that you're having a moving party and the compensation is free pizza. At the end of it. Because that you're skirting labor laws if you do that. It's like, oh Lord, just let them be, man. Let them be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it's, again, these are the people who scream like a business is not a person, as though that's any kind of argument in any other context, saying like, well, it's different when it's a business. And it's like, okay, how does that work for like self-employed people? How does that work when, is it okay if the manager of the Chick-fil-A just wanted these people to hand out chicken sandwiches that he had extra? Like, where do you draw these arbitrary lines? It's all stupid and it's all silly. If two people agree to something voluntarily, no one else has any right to step in and say that they can't do that. That's just absurd.
Yep, totally agree. All right, speaking of absurd, we've got a series of tweets by Paul Krugman, verified Twitter user and failed economist. That predicted very failed, and predicted, not in the good way, but in the actual very failed way, predicted the internet would go the way of the fax machine type of failed. Anyways, he tweets out, since I get lots of mockery for having talked about a, quote, Biden boom, unquote, I thought I'd share a chart. And this is a chart of cumulative jobs added since, Biden was in office, or the first 17 months of Biden versus Trump in office. Biden's looks really, really good. I think it's like 9 million jobs added in his first 17 months. And Trump is sitting around 4 or 5 million jobs added in his first 17 months as president. And then Paul Krugman goes on, the problem may be that the Biden economy boomed too much, feeding inflation, and that it now needs to cool off, which may involve a recession. But it hasn't yet. I love that he had to sneak that in there. And yes, I know that there are all kinds of issues about different starting points, the role of federal policy, etc. But the basic fact is that so far, the Biden economy has added 9 million jobs. So it has been a jobs boom, whatever else you may say. Oh my gosh, man. It's like, okay, how can you be an economist and just kind of brush aside the past 2.5 years of the economy being shut down? You can account for every single job that Biden has, quote, added to the economy with the fact that the economy reopened. So I think the total jobs market was about 158 million people employed in 2019. And then in 2020, that dropped down to 142 million people employed because we shut everything down, right? So you basically had a net loss of about 11 million jobs. Not even 11, a little bit more than that. And then now, in 2021, we went back up to about 150 million jobs. And then now we're about 158 million jobs again. So yeah, Biden's added, or there's been 9 million jobs that have come back since Biden's been in office, but he hasn't actually had that big of a net gain of jobs if you compare it to 2019. And so it's factually true. Like what Paul Krugman was saying is factually true. And he claims that in his last year, but it provides no insight. It provides no actual context. And it is not supportive of the narrative that he's trying to get around that, like, oh, Biden's this economic wizard or something like that that's doing such a great job. And I also love that he sneaks in there which may involve a recession, but hasn't yet. Because Paul Krugman's been one of the folks out there saying, oh, well, yeah, we've had 2 quarters of negative growth in the economy, but that's not a recession. A recession is when I say it's a recession, basically. It's just like, what a phony and a hack, man. This guy all he does is he exists to prop up a narrative and to say that the approved people are the ones that you should be listening to, and they have his certified expert opinion. But all you need to do is just look at the jobs that were around in 2019, look at the jobs that were lost in 2020, and look at the jobs we're at now, and it's like we've never moved in time basically since 2019. It's the same exact scenario. So, it's all Biden has done is get it to as good as it was before COVID. That's it. And I would hesitate to say it's been in spite of him. It's not been because of him. If he had his way, we'd still be in the same scenario that we were back in 2020 and 2021.
I am such a fan of his last tweet in particular because and yes, I know there are all kinds of issues about different starting points, the role of federal policy, etc. But the basic fact is that they've added 9 million. That makes me think of that meme from that one really, I can't even think of the name of the show, but it's, like the guy dressed up as the hot dog, and we're all wondering who did this, and it's like very obviously him kind of a thing. It's like you can't just go like, I bet you, $10 that this pig will fly. And you're like, okay, sure. And then you pick up the pig and you throw it in the air and you record it going up and falling and then post that. Say, look, the pig flew. Now, yes, I know there are all kinds of different issues about whether or not I picked him up and threw him in the air or not. But the fact remains he was in the air traveling upward. So therefore, the pig flew. And you know, it's like, no, the entire argument of why that wouldn't be the case is the very thing you're trying to say. Yes, I know that would be an issue, but the fact, it's like, no, you don't just get to wave that away. That's the entire argument. So, the starting point is exactly as you pointed out. The starting point is the argument. It's like, yeah, you can add 9,000 jobs, but if you took away 11 or 9 million, but if you take away 11 million, then what you've done isn't impressive, unless you live in the classic history started when Biden entered office syndrome, which so many people seem to have. I mean, I don't get how people can take him seriously when you have studied this thing. If you are not an economics minded person, I get it, because he manipulates the data well. And if he's, the expert with the credentials, him saying something like, yes, I know there are kinds of issues about different starting points and all that stuff, yada, yada. The confidence with which you can just wave that away, if you are not well versed in economics and you don't feel confident, you might get intimidated. Be like, oh, I guess that's not an issue. He seems to be able to dismiss that. So I guess he's handled it. But the reality is, that is the argument, and he's just playing a game where he can just dismiss it, and so he doesn't have to answer to that. He doesn't have to address it, because he can just say, yes, and I know that it's kind of like saying, well, we don't know that the job loss had to do with the economy shutting down. And yes, I know there are these issues about correlation and causation, but frankly, we don't need to address them because correlation doesn't equal causation. And you're like, oh, I guess that's true. It's like, no. You don't just get to wave away the chief objections and pretend they don't exist just because you acknowledged them and said that there are issues. That doesn't cut it. That's the argument, and you have to actually address it and not just wave it away. Otherwise, literally everything you're saying is meaningless. And as is most of the time the case with Krugman, what are you saying is meaningless?
Yeah. It reminds me, I had this buddy down in Texas, and he was he was in the Army, and they had some like joint training camp with the Army and the Marines. And he's like, to point out the difference between the Army and the Marines, like we had like a night like navigation and jog, competition, and like the Army guys completed it in like 3 hours or something like that because they took the most efficient way to get back to base. And then the Marines took like 6 or 7 hours to get back. And I'm not in the Army or in the military, so I don't know the differences and why people don't like each other or whatever. But he was making fun of them because the Marines got back, after these guys had gotten back, cleaned up, had breakfast and all this stuff. And the Marines, came in all oorahing and being like, oh, we ran for 7 hours, like look how tough we are. And my buddy's like, no, you're just stupid. Like, you ran for 7 hours, but the point of the exercise is, and what you're measured against is how fast you got back to base. And that's what Krugman's doing here. It's like you're measuring like, oh yeah, 9 million jobs have come back under Biden, but like, is that really what matters? I think what matters is like, what jobs have we improved over the past 3 years, right? Like, have we improved over the past 3 years, or have we gotten worse, or have we stayed about the same, which is also getting worse, right? That's stagnation. And the answer is we've stagnated. We are just now getting back to where we were at in 2019. And and a lot of it is not because of Biden. It's just because, states have said, oh man, I guess the reality of the life is we can't shut down like this anymore. It's killing people. And so, they've reopened, and now jobs are coming back naturally because of that. It's not there's nothing to assign to Biden in terms of his success in bringing work back.
And just to seal that off, if anyone is going to say, well, Biden reopened the economy and Trump shut it down, Trump shouldn't have shut it down, and that was wrong. But Biden was also championing those kinds of policies too. So the fact that Biden reopened it up is no credit to him, other than he finally, saw that, well, and whether or not he did or not. But, it's like states started opening up and states started sort of defying these national orders and things. And then he eventually relented. So there's no credit to him for that, because he was championing the shutdowns. He oversaw the shutdowns, and both Trump and Biden's big fault is that Anthony Fauci is still hired, and they still listen to all the conglomerates he works with, and they're still mired into all that sort of corruption and scandal. So like, yeah, it's good that Biden was able to reopen and get us back to where we were, but that's not a good thing from Biden because he supported the same things that brought us down 11 million to begin with.
Yes. Yep. I don't have any more on this one unless you do.
Nope, we're good.
Awesome. Well, folks, thanks for hanging out with us during the show. And like I said, this top of it, be sure to like, share, comment, subscribe, DM us. We love to hear it and love to talk with you. And we will catch you on the next one.